And what we'll do is we'll spend more time for the speakers, 20 minutes presentation each, so that we actually have time for discussions and also don't break too much into the lunch time. So we are starting a bit late, but 20 minutes. We will put up a timer for you so that we know when 5 minutes are remaining of your presentation. That's for both you, Divya and Rajshri. So we'll take the questions after that.
Thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I do feel a little out of place. I am not trained in linguistics. I do not come from a department of education such as the one in JNU. But I come from the adjacent department of Center for Historical Studies in JNU, and I am here speaking from my research, which is in a subfield called History of Education, which was quite popular in the 60s and 70s and took a huge dip and is now again seeing a comeback with a lot of globalization and privatization of education. What I'm going to present today is part of my long-term research, which I've been doing since my PhD. I have moved forth from here in the last couple of years. But I thought this might be of interest to some of you because it's good to go back to history quite a bit. Some of it might be a repetition for those of you who are from Kerala, and we are so used to hearing the words Namothanam all the time, social reform. And as Sajita had pointed out to the question of, is education actually for social emancipation? And that is a larger philosophical question to deal with. So it doesn't directly speak to the data that was presented in the morning, but it's just to go back, or as I call it, the past as present, to see how some of the concerns that all of you were raising here have been echoed in the past for at least 100 to 150 years. So what has happened is it's morphed into new forms as new forms of economic production have taken place, as society changed, but some of the fundamental concerns continue to remain the same. Hold on. Okay. Yeah. So my research tries to take into account erstwhile princely states of Travancore and Cochin. Cochin is missing here. Sorry for that. And British administered Malabar. And this is something that very often we miss, at least on the historical studies in Kerala, perhaps due to resource shortage or let's say lack of enough academic literature. But we have to remember that there has been a disparity between the two regions on many, many counts. And British administration was very lax in terms of promoting education, and which is perhaps why a lot of districts today in North Kerala continue to face those historical challenges as opposed to the princely states. But I am not a big believer in this enlightened state label. I find it very problematic. If you look deeper into history, the Travancore and Cochin kings were constantly under threat of annexation by the British, and in order to ward them off, and also with limited powers that they were given in social sector, they pushed forth education measures. So in my research, I try to disrupt this model of this enlightened state as if the king was so benevolent and so charitable, but there's a lot of politics behind being all of that. Now, this is where I integrate two fields, which is childhood studies and history of education. Childhood studies has emerged in South Asia, parts of Southeast Asia in the last 20 years. It's a very popular and rich field in the Northwest. But I do find great relevance in linking questions of childhood and education. And just briefly explain this to you. We take the category for childhood for granted. And I could see that since yesterday, that there is very little conversation on the child. And I understand psychologists have taken it. In fact, they were leading these conversations several decades ago. Today, neurologists, sociologists, anthropologists have now come on board of who is the child. We will all agree that child tends to be a very age-related category. And just to take a second to all of you, could you all tell me who is a child? According to you, who is a child? Or who is in Malayalam we say kutti, or who is a child? Any of you? Who is a? Who the adults said. So Dr. Minati says whom the adults label as a child, yeah. But really, every day, who is a child? How do you recognize a child? Teachers, how do you recognize a child? by age, right? We often say somebody below the particular age is a child by maturity, by stature, by the fact that they require, care, their needs have to be met. But there was a great struggle to have a consensus on who is the child. So we know on paper, most states have agreed that 18 is the age for adulthood, which is why at 18 you can do many things. But there is no widespread consensus in everyday social life because we also have child labor in this country. So, and there are so many contradictions. If you all agree with me that between 0 and 15 is a child, a lot of 15-year-old teenagers will say, don't treat us as a child. We are teenagers, which is an American term from Stanley Hall, right? If you're unmarried, you're a child in Indian society. You could be 30 years old and unmarried, and your parents will call you a child. A very frequent phenomenon in Kerala. A 35-year-old is also kutti. Why? Because he or she is unmarried, right? But it doesn't really fit into the legal category of childhood. So therefore, childhood is also a construct. Historically, it has changed. And my question and the provocation to all of you is, what role does education play in defining this child? And in Kerala, we have seen, and it's proven by your own case studies, that a good child is an educated child, right? So education is at the core of childhood formation in a state like Kerala. That is why all communities are heavily invested in education. A child who is not educated is often seen as a failure, a marginal child, a problematic child, and we place so much cultural and economic and nowadays emotional value to education. That is, no matter what, you will educate your child, which is one of the reasons why there is a great success in literacy rates. Or in Malayalam, we say Nalla Kutti. But Nalla Kutti, we know, has also a lot of moral underpinnings. So I'm interested in seeing how do constructions of education and constructions of childhood go together. It may not be very visible for those of you working with data, but for those who do ethnographic studies, many of you who have gone to the classrooms, the teachers are already working with certain notions of childhood. Children already have certain notions of their childhood. There is a question of autonomy. There's a question of agency. But we also know that everybody's childhood is not the same in a region like South Asia. There is no neutral childhood. If we all say children are innocent, children are playful, children need care, then Palestine shouldn't be happening, right? Conflicts in Africa shouldn't be happening. So clearly some children in some parts of the world have lesser value than some children in other parts of the world. But we all in this room agree that all children are the same. They all require love and care. Which brings me to my next point, that it's a highly political category. It's a highly politicized category. Childhood is political, which is why your state is heavily interested in regulating the child. Please don't be mistaken that the state is doing it only as a matter of its duty. Families, communities, and state is heavily invested in childhood formation because everybody is interested in the question of the future. Children are seen as assets to the future. In my research, I look at these questions. I won't go into detail. I'm just drawing connections to the relevance of the seminar here. What I'm trying to do is, one, to pursue to rethink Kerala's model of development. Of course, there is no doubt that certain matrices were met. Compared to other states in India, there's a lot to be proud of and happy about. But what exactly is development? It needs to be unpacked. Yesterday a lot of conversation happened on this. There has to be an investigation in the politics of language itself. A lot of the conversation yesterday on English, I think, could have been enhanced with looking at the politics of English itself, right? What is the status attributed to it? Why are parents sending them to low-cost schools? Geeta Nambishan and others in JNU have done studies for the longest time in saying that even poor parents in other states will rather send a child to a low-cost English school than to a reasonable government school. What does it mean to speak English in terms of migration? Sajita had mentioned this, so on and so forth. This has a long history. That is, who has to be taught in English and why and how much. And in my research, I show it's a comparison between Malabar and Travancore, within which I look at a very dominant OBC community today, which is also my employer community, the Nadar community, and the Dalit community in Kerala. And all the actors involved, all the stakeholders involved in the 19th and 20th century said, not everybody needs to learn English. right? Because that means it's a passport to employment, a passport to a better future. So education itself was, or school education was structured in such a way that there was a bifurcation of the vernacular and English, and the elites of this country have really benefited from that. Teachers and teacher reform is something that I'm interested in now, but I thought it speaks to a lot of your research. But again, coming back to schooling the modern child, the fundamental question of who is the modern child. A modern child is an educated child. But what do we mean by education in everyday sense and not philosophical? Is somebody who can read and write. And that is why there is so much emphasis on reading and writing. And I think the disturbing trend that we are seeing is when we say Malayali children are not able to read, there is also underlying anxieties of modernity. There is underlying anxieties of what does it mean to be modern in today's day and age. Some of you, especially students, were wondering how does one write a history of this? I am jealous of ethnographers and contemporary scholars because your children are alive and in front of you in the classroom. But for historians, they are long dead and gone. You can't speak on behalf of the child. I cannot speculate. Children rarely left sources. In Europe, there are some sources, but in a highly illiterate country like us, caste hierarchical, it's next to impossible to find anything that children wrote. Children did write here and there, but they were mediated by different actors. And these are one of the main actors who are the Christian missionaries who came to Kerala. I look at three main missionaries. There were many societies who came, but you are familiar with the CMS, the LMS, the London Missionary Society, Church Missionary Society, very, very dominant British Protestants, and the Basel German Missionary Society in Malabar. And today we remember Basel Mission only because Herman Gundert, who compiled our dictionary, and also the Kannada dictionary, his friend Kittel, they both come from the Basel Mission. And I use textbooks. So briefly before I stop, I'll also talk about how looking at the history of textbooks gives you some insights into the kind of reading and writing practices that were encouraged historically. This is just for your basic information. There has been a dominant notion in South Asian society that schools were top down, that the state introduced schools, the missionaries democratized schools, all of that is true, that poor communities do not understand the value of education. It's a very standard stereotype, right? Something we heard in Kartika's paper on tribes, that tribal children don't know the value of education. So we have to teach them. But you see historically that despite all the violence that was unleashed on them, despite all their resource shortages, subaltern communities in Kerala had their own imagination of a school. It may not have been a physically built school like we know today, but school as a site of learning, school as a site of congregation, as a modern idea was being spread across communities in the 19th century. And of course, for many Dalits in Kerala, because they were exposed to Christian missionaries, and missionaries, of course, had their own agenda, there is no doubt about it. But they had what we call like a multiplier effect, unintended consequences. You can see that in parts of central Travancore, they were what the missionaries called slave schools. Vinil Paul, Sanal Mohan, and others have written on it. Just to give you an idea of who were the earlier teachers. Ashans were the name given to earlier indigenous teachers. And the reason why I'm saying this is a lot of conversation here happened on teachers and teacher training. But historically, when this modern school of system of education was introduced, when the Travancore government introduced the Department of Public Instruction, where did the teachers come from? They came from, they were indigenous teachers who were now being retrained to enter the modern system. There was some value in retaining them, the Ashans. But what was the discursive contestation? The Ashan was often considered an Oriental despot. Right? Your ordinary school teacher was considered to be anti-child. And this is where the narrative gets a bit more complex. That is, the British and the others were saying that Indian indigenous teachers, they know Sanskrit, Malayalam, arithmetic, all of that is fine. But they are culturally, they do not know modern forms of care and parenting. And that's where the civilizing mission comes in. We will teach Indian teachers what best is childhood, what best is schooling, right? So you see the clash of cultural ideologies. You also see the colonial civilizing mission happening. But at the same time, due to resource shortage, the British and the kings also have to rely on the same teachers. This is from Edgar Thurston, who was in charge of the Madras Museum and an amateur anthropologist. He used to put out these tracts. Nowadays I see Edgar Thurston selling in DC Books and others. For students, he was a colonial anthropologist, right? So please remember, when you buy the book, it's not a new book. But just to give you an idea, and this is central to my research in the last few years, it is of course a point that has been reiterated by many scholars, but I'm trying to show it through childhood studies. That from the very beginning, caste was very central to the idea of schooling itself. And in Travancore, administration report itself reveals that in the name of preserving custom, whatever custom meant, whatever is tradition, right? They were trying to segregate children on the basis of caste from the very beginning. By 1865, the department has started. 1867, the vernacular schools leaving certificate is also introduced. But there is so much resistance by the elites to open schools for all, which meant poorly qualified, poorly infrastructured schools were provided to subaltern populations from the very beginning. And you can see that the state has a very major role to play, which meant the children who managed to go to these low-cost schools already had a historical lag. So by the time they become adults and then generational change, there is a great generational gap. Just to move on to say, we are a state that has taken pride in female literacy. But this is just to give you, I thought I'll pull this from my research to link it to the English debate. One set of people that nobody in India really wanted to teach English were females across communities. Even the upper caste said there is no point teaching girls English. One, they will get alienated. They will think they are Mem Sahibs or Madamas, like we say in Kerala, or they will think too much of themselves. And the same attitude was present even in subaltern communities and even by missionaries. So the same missionaries who were providing schooling had very different gender segregation and caste segregation. And we see that today as well. And many of you might know, until many years ago, the average Kerala community has great contempt for women who speak English. We mock women on TV who speak in English. We think they're too anglicized. Ranjani Haridas was trolled for years for speaking anglicized English, right? We are a community where the average Malayali male has great, what we call pucham, contempt for women who speak English, right? And that is not a behavioral trait of the Malayali man. There are historical trends that show there was no need to teach them English, because that meant they would forget their roles of domesticity. After all, they have to be made good wives and good mothers. If at all they have to be doing some job, they can go for teaching. So like Anusha and others have been saying, teaching has been highly feminized, even nursing. And that has this long-term history to say, and you can see these missionaries agreeing with the government saying, yes, no need to start English medium girls' schools. And there is a great push from the Nadar community who actually said, no, we want our girls to learn English and to come out of bonded agriculture and learn English, right? So communities itself are pushing forth for the need for English education. What else was then being given in these schools? So I, of course, use missionary schools as an example, but you see it similarly in many government schools as well. Sewing or stitching, which the Nadar community was very infamous for, that was being taught. Female missionaries knew this skill back in Europe because that was what they were being trained in. And they brought it, back to India. It wasn't fully successful, but the idea was highly gendered from the beginning. So in many of these schools, in the afternoon, boys were asked to do gardening, carpentry, blacksmithy, or something else. But girls were expected to do more feminized jobs, which we see, there are some researches happening on this, where we see later trickled into home science, home economics. And today we see in many schools, SUPW and other activities where girls are taught stitching, but not boys, because it was highly gendered. So from the very beginning, childhood is gendered and childhood is caste centric, right? Girls do not have the same experience of childhood as boys. This is just, for general public interest. The Basel mission was very keen on exercise. I'm not going into detail, but a lot of debates on modernity, especially in sociology, focus on the idea of the body, like self-regulation of the body, self-disciplining, productivity. These are all key discourses in modernity. What does it mean to be modern? It means to have a new temporal and spatial consciousness. To be able to regulate yourself and have certain habits is what makes you modern. And schools Many teachers here will know schools are the number one places where the child's body is regulated, and the school timetable is an example of regulating. So each this time that is allocated for different activities, and as Kartika and others said, any other distraction is stopped, and you are punished heavily if you deviate from this time work regime that has been put for you. So these are boarding schools. It's one part of my research, but just to give you an idea, in the construction of the poor child was always considered as a laboring child. Let's not forget that, right? Which is why there were debates until the 20th century saying, why should we educate this poor child? What is the point of educating this SC, ST, OBC child? They are not going to go into white collar employment. They should not go, because if they go, who will do agriculture? And you see the same. And so missionaries and the government actually agreed on many things, like today's elites, right? Let the poor students go to industrial training. Let them do diplomas. Why should they do academic degrees, professional degrees, right? But this has a long history across the world where poor children's manual labor was valued than their intellectual labor. And labor was integrated into the schooling curriculum itself. And we will see in Kerala's history, there was a lot of resistance from the subaltern community saying, we don't want to do labor. We are here to learn English. We are here to learn maths and science. Don't ask us to do stigmatized labor again and again in the schools. And many industrial schools were a big failure by the 20th century. Just some examples of the Basel Mission Industries. Just to conclude in 2 minutes, I think there is some, let's say, a lot of importance, relevance to looking at older textbooks, right? In the last 20 years, we have gotten carried away in India by only looking at the history textbooks, which we should look at given the extreme politicization. But if you look at 19th, 20th century textbooks, and I'm just using a case study, these were the main topics being taught in the primary schools: moral education and political economy. And this might be interest to CDS students because this was very fashionable in Ireland and England. So it's a legacy of the empire where poor children had to be taught in rules of political economy, basic political economy, on wages, on capital, on labor. And if you read this Easy Lessons, it's actually by the Irish Archbishop Richard Whately. Whately was a member of the National Commission for Irish Schools. And he had written the book actually in 1835. But the book continued to be popular in the empire until the 1880s, and a compulsory textbook in Travancore. And I can understand why the king found it appealing. It is all about how agriculturalists should remain in agriculture, should be friendly with the capitalists. If you all work together, you can enjoy each other's profits. Do not have strike, because in 1830s, Ireland was facing a lot of strife. And similar lessons are being taught. A lot, but Easy Lessons was so popular in Bengal, Tamil Nadu, erstwhile Tamil Nadu, and parts of Travancore, that many Malayali authors like Joseph Moolil, he was a Basel Mission convert, later he worked for the Madras Presidency, he incorporated parts of it in his Malabar textbooks published by the Basel Mission. And you can see that Whately's excerpts were used in various forms to talk about the same message. But because Moolil came from a Tia background, he would subvert the lessons by saying, well, we must all work towards capitalism, but it cannot work in a feudal place like India because of caste. So in a way, he was subverting it in the same textbook by telling children, do your work, but let us now get rid of feudalism first. So just to see, how all of these are linked in terms of, there are a lot of debates. You can look it up in the Niyama Sabha proceedings online. A lot of debate in Travancore, Sri Moolam Assembly, Cochin Legislative Council on who is a Nallakutty, what are the Malayalam readers. Just to conclude, just to give you an example, how Whately's lessons were used in Travancore by the state. And you can see, and this is very similar to the neoliberal argument of blaming individuals for poverty. Poverty is now constructed as an individual lack. You are poor because you don't work hard. You are lazy. If you were smart, you wouldn't be poor, right? And that's what Whately is saying. And that has taken form in these textbooks. If you read the story of Shankar and Raman, they clearly wasted their father's wealth and they got into debt, right? And you can see the sentence, had they not squandered their wealth, they could have become rich too. It's in Malayalam, I translated it. And so instead of looking at poverty as a structural issue, textbooks are increasingly saying it's an individual issue, which is neoliberalism saying it in a very different, sophisticated manner to you, right? Be more productive and things like that. Just again, just one more minute. The Travancore Assembly came up in 1905. It's a rare picture that I was able to get in a London magazine. Education was undoubtedly the biggest agenda because it gave representation to almost every community in Travancore. The idea was to only listen to complaints and have some moderate conversation, but later it became very politicized because every community decided to put forth education, which brings me back to my inaugural point: why education? Why were all these communities fighting for education? Because it was closely linked to social transformation, individual emancipation, and modernity. Everybody wants to be modern. There's a modern selfhood project happening. It was also a way of claiming a stake in citizenship, at least in those days, monarchical citizenship. But if you look at the debates on compulsory education, just a background to M.K. Raman's quote, the first resolution for education was introduced in 1926 by another member of the assembly in Cochin Legislative Council. Cochin has also seen a lot of reform, but it was not passed. When was Cochin and Travancore's Compulsory Education Act passed? Only in 1948. So somebody introduces the bill in 26. It takes 22 years because the assembly and the council kept delaying it in both Travancore and Cochin, and the debate was always the same. Why do we have to educate them? Who will give them midday meals? Their fathers are alcoholic. Who will do the agriculture? And all these subaltern members are saying, no. And M.K. Raman was the most vociferous of people who said, and he says it very eloquently, that there is no point of division in labor and intelligence. It's not distributed exclusively. Primary education is fundamental. Today, we trumpet that Kerala had one of the earliest compulsory education acts, but a simple look into history will tell you 22 years for them to pass it. They eventually passed it because after the Second World War and the economic recession that we were facing, and internationally, many states had passed compulsory education, and Travancore felt, okay, they should also go with the tide. But there was a great resistance to introduce compulsion for the poor child, to pull them out of schools. I just want to tell you what happens after this. M.K. Raman says this, which I assume was a dramatic conversation, but his opposer, an upper caste member, got up and said, this is communal. You are now bringing caste into the parliament. You are being communal, and that provokes the assembly, and every other elite member says Raman is communal. Raman is from an OBC community. So you can imagine how caste was being selectively used to accuse a subaltern caste member of communalization when he actually was speaking the truth. This is just in conclusion to tell you this quintessential picture of Kerala's education. Again, want to reiterate, after all these years, we tend to slip into a equation between literacy and education, at least not in this room, but the average Malayali says we are 100% literate, assuming we are 100% educated. That myth has been busted, even by scholars like Devika and others in CDS. This is not to say that our achievements were not historical. It definitely has a long protracted struggle for rights, and it's not easily a replicatable model. We can't just say, why doesn't Orissa do this? Why doesn't Bengal do it? It doesn't work like that historically. But what we see today is that the poor child has changed. Today, the poor child is not only our SC/ST child, but children of migrant workers. And they are going to start entering our schools. And anyway, we are seeing other kinds of social anxieties. And this question of multilingualism, teachers are really going to face a challenge, let alone struggling with Malayalam. Imagine Assamese, Bengali, Odia, Hindi, and other languages, right? So by the time I completed my research in 2017, the question was, who is the poor child? And turns out the poor child is not always or necessarily a Malayali child. And therefore, again, the question of childhood. Are we going to place the same value to the migrant child as much as we place to the overprotected, infantilized Malayali child, right? So we see, we protect the Malayali child so much, but somehow the migrant child is constantly insulted in many occasions as not good enough. And that is a question for Malayalis as a whole to ask. And I do think we need to shift the debate a bit and look at questions of childhood and parenting and so on and so forth. Yeah, thanks so much.